Hey everybody, this is kind of a follow-up video to a video I recently posted to YouTube. I posted a video about upgrading an HP, well actually a Compaq Presario desktop computer, and I mentioned I was going to create a separate video about the Bestech ATX 25012Z power supply that HP has been using in their modern machines. And in that previous video I mentioned how this power supply here, I mean, overall it has had some changes done to it, but the basic design of it has not changed since 2002 or 2003, whenever they started using these things. The outputs have not changed, the casing style has not changed, the connectors have not changed. Well, at least I don't think anyway. No, they haven't changed, they still have the same connectors. This is a fine example of HP pretty much cutting corners to get more or less cutting corners to make more profit by using cheaper components. Here's the power supply itself. Here's the spec label. Pause review specs. Okay, so basically this is a 250 watt power supply, and used to be when these first came out, they would typically be installed in they would usually be installed in machines with Pentium 4 processors and Celeron processors, and those were pretty much basic computers that didn't require that much power. But for instance, nowadays HP is throwing these power supplies into machines that have quad-core 95 watt processors, a big 70 gig hard drive, 4 gigs of RAM. I mean, it's lots of stuff, and they're still using this same old power supply. And in the modern HPs, of course, the modern day computers have SATA drives and 24-pin motherboards. But basically HP just tosses this power supply into those machines and use their 20-pin connector on the 24-pin motherboard. And to make this power supply work with the SATA drives, they use Molex 4-pin to SATA adapters. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And the power supply itself, I mean, I can't really complain about the quality of the unit, but well, there is one thing I can complain about, is the capacitor choice. It seems like Bestech has decided to go cheap on their capacitors. Used to be they were using Jamicon capacitors in all of their units, and in some cases OST. And shine some light in here. And then they decided to switch over to all Capzon or TPO in their units. For all these years, they used, like I said, they was using Jamicons on the 5 volt standby and the output. And they always tend to use Capzon on the primaries, which that wasn't a big deal because those usually didn't have problems. But basically, the thing about these capacitors is the new ones, like I said, the Capzons and the TPOs seem to have a high failure rate. And in the 250 watt 12Z units, this capacitor here next to the heatsink, and there's another capacitor over this direction. It's a little one over there behind. It's right behind the filter chokes here. It is this one over here is a 2200 microfarad at 10 volt capacitor, and the other one is a 220 microfarad at 50 volt capacitor or 35 volt capacitor. Sometimes they use 35 volt, sometimes they use 50 volt, and those are highly common for failing. And in the newer units that use the Capzon and TPOs on the outputs, those tend to fail too, causing problems. So these power supplies are not very reliable until they're recapped. And now I'm going to show you another unit that have recapped. Okay, here's another power supply, another ATX 25012Z power supply, and I've done a partial recap on this unit, and as you might be able to see, the capacitor right next to the heatsink is a Rubicon MBZ, more or less a Rubicon MBZ, and it is a 2200 microfarad 6.3 volt capacitor. And normally you're not supposed to go down volts on a capacitor, but in this case I had an idea what the voltage on this capacitor gets, and it's usually around 5 volts. So I went just put a 6.3 volt cap in its place. And here's another capacitor over here. This is actually a Radio Shack capacitor. And while I don't really recommend use of Radio Shack capacitors, I haven't had any issues with them. Even though this brand Leyland used to have really bad problems back in the early 2000s. They seem to have got their act together and got their stuff fixed. And on the left over here we have a couple of just different caps I've changed out in here. Some pulls from other power supplies. And so this power supply here is good to go. And anyways, here's the spec label on this unit. I'll be able to see here. Pretty much, this is a different revision, but same specs. And let me go over connections right quick. I mentioned a few minutes ago that these units are pretty much 2002 compliant. They have a 20-pin ATX connector for the motherboard. They have 4 molecular connections, typical for a 2002 compliant Pentium 4 desktop computer. And they have an ATX 12 connection that was required for most of the Pentium 4 CPUs back in the day. And so far I haven't seen any of these get used on motherboards that required 8-pin CPU connections, which any kind of motherboard with that kind of connection with a hefty CPU would require a bigger wattage power supply. And I hope HP would have the common sense to install a 300 watt or higher power supply in a machine like that. But like I'm saying, this power supply here, I've seen it in machines with quad-core Athlon II CPUs clocked at 3 gig, 95 watt TDP processors, 4 gigs of RAM, 70 gig hard drive, all that sort of stuff. So more or less this was a follow-up video to my previous video on upgrading the Compaq desktop computer. And if you want to see what this power supply looks like with the cover off and more or less the power supply board pulled out of the case, go look at my recent videos called Filthy Power Supply versus Clean Power Supply. And this is not the exact same power supply, but it's one just like it. Well, two just like it actually. One's dirty and one's clean. Anyway, if any questions or comments, feel free to ask.